Hi all, our notable game today is between the great Magnus Carlsen, the current world chess champion, and Hikaru Nakamura. This was played in round 7 of the London Chess Classic. So prior to this game, in classical games, Magnus Carlsen has a staggering record against Nakamura, 11-0 up with 18 draws. Now if you include rapid or exhibition games, Magnus Carlsen has beaten Nakamura 19-5 with 25 draws. If it's only rapid or exhibition games, the score is Magnus Carlsen has beaten Nakamura 7-5 with 7 draws. So yeah, it seems on the classical time controls, Nakamura hasn't had much luck against Carlsen. He has come very close though, extremely close on occasion. It's an unbearably close game where he played basically one of the only moves to kind of lose. It's that bad, but the record, it looks pretty stark. Let's put it that way. So Magnus here kicks off with d4. It's a classical game. d5, c4. We see c6, a solid Slav system. We have knight f3, knight f6. Now a modest move here. Instead of knight c3, which seems to be the most popular, we see e3, closing in the bishop. And quite often bishop f5 seems to be the main move here. For those who are not Slav defense gurus, you might be wondering about the b7 pawn. This has a response here, queen b6. This is okay. And if white wants to do damage to the pawn structure, this is meant to be equal. Even though it looks a bit wretched, this should be okay for black, this sort of position. It's about equal. So basically, e3, it seems bishop f5 is popular, e6 is also popular, and bishop g4, pinning the knight, actually. This is kicked, this bishop now. Quite often bishop takes f3 is played here, but we see bishop h5. And now quite often knight c3, keeping this central tension going. So for example, knight c3, e6, and now g4, bishop g6. This kind of continuation has been seen quite a bit, where white might not even fianchetto the bishop here, but play bishop d3. So this is seen quite a bit. There's actually 7 games even from here in live, but 7 major games. It's meant to be about equal. But a little bit of a surprise theoretically, we see the early release of the tension in the center, c takes d5. It has been played before. C takes d5. Quite often black takes the opportunity here, instead of recapturing the pawn to take on f3, and this is meant to be about equal, this position here. The queen's kind of doesn't seem to be greatly positioned in some respects here, and it's meant to be about equal. So bishop takes f3 is interesting, making sure the queen's on f3 here, and black seems to be fairly solid. But Nakamura actually, after c takes d5, this is the less usual response, c takes d5. So we have knight c3, e6, g4, bishop g6. And with the queen on d1, it has that versatility. It can go to b3, it can go to a4 still, maybe. Knight e5, which carries the threat potentially of this diagonal being quite painful. You can imagine the queen coming out as well. So the knight on e5 is challenged like this, with this retreat. And in doing so, black would gain development advantage if knight takes d7. But the point of moving the knight twice is to get the light square bishop. H takes g. And now covering the weaknesses, this fianchetto bishop covers the light square weaknesses. But also on g2, there's a possibility of e4 to try and break down black's pawn structure in the center and open up the position for the bishop pair. Knight c6. White does indeed, in this position, take the opportunity to open up the position here with e4. So Magnus is keen for his bishops to be good in this game. This is an early sign, and he doesn't mind, it seems, about the d4 pawn being isolated here. D takes, knight takes e4. We have bishop b4 check, and the knight just retreats. So we have an isolated queen's pawn, and this seems to be a very natural blockading move. So it seems as if this pawn is potentially vulnerable, and potentially black is going to give white hanging pawns with bishop takes c3. That's another possibility. Both sides now castle here. And now actually we have d5. So opening up the position a bit. Knight takes d5. So the centre has been cleared of pawns. And we have bishop c5. The knight goes back. Bishop d4. Black seems to be threatening to fracture the pawns like this, leaving two isolated pawns. Magnus is not concerned. He just moves the queen to f3. Well, at least in this position there's also the possibility of queen takes c3 in any case. Queen f6. And now the queen's come off. Queen takes. And now bishop f4. So here, white isn't concerned about bishop takes c3. White will have the bishop pair. Rook ad8. And the rooks stare at each other. And here, in fact, Nakamura took the decision to fracture white's pawns by giving up, of course, the bishop pair to white. So an interesting scenario has been set by the opening at move 23. Some simplification. Who is better? Is it controversial for both sides? Controversial for white, double-edged because of the fractured pawn structure. Controversial for black because these bishops could be really good. With the centre opened up, you'd think maybe some weight needs to be given to the bishop pair. They're blasting through the position here, aren't they? But one of the knights comes to torture immediately the isolated c3 pawn. It's moved here, and the knight comes in to c3, threatening the rook, and also knight e2 check. It seems quite dangerous. White responds with rook d2 quite elegantly, extinguishing the knight e2 check and the problem on d1. We have rook takes d2, bishop takes. The knight checks anyway. Rook d8, bishop comes to e3. Knight c3 hitting a2 or threatening a2. That's just moved up one here. So again, we have a situation here. What are the trump cards for both sides? White has the bishop pair. Black has structural advantage, at least on the queen side it would seem. On the king side he has double pawns though. The rook is more active on the centre file though. Rook d3. Is this dangerous for white? White calmly plays rook c1 here. And now we have the knight kind of being pinned to the c4 pawn. So we see knight d1 hitting e3, gaining a tempo. Bishop e4, kicking the rook back, because otherwise the knight's going to drop, of course. And now here, getting out of the way of knight takes e3, bishop c5. And it seems white is ready for things like rook c2 and bishop d5. The bishops seem quite comfortable at the moment. No big consequence of the fractured pawns, it seems. Knight b2. Rook c2 hitting the knight again, going back to a4. And hitting the bishop. The bishop drops back now. Knight b6. Okay, so what has black achieved here? With the knights, they seem to be provoking white's pawns forwards. Again, c5 is actually played here, relieving the pressure, but blocking in the bishop. Is that controversial? Knight d5. We have rook d2 pinning against the rook on d7. Knight f6 offering the exchange of rooks. So we have an even more simplified endgame scenario now. The two bishops literally against the two knights and nothing else apart from pawns. King g3. We have king f8. And now f4, white is making some space advantage on the king side and extinguishing the use of the e5 square. Knight f3, the bishop drops back. King e7. And here, an interesting decision, which may not occur to many players. Structurally, black's defect would seem to be the double pawns, but sometimes you have to convert theoretical weaknesses into more exploitable ones. And here we see a move which portrays that concept. White actually plays f5, saying to black, look, I'll undouble your pawns, but I'm going to get something else here. Some pressure, more pressure on the dark squares. G takes, and of course, white's pawns here on both sides of the board, they're both isolated pawns. Look at black's structure. Structurally, it seems black's better, but white's bishop pair looks quite dangerous. And also, with these pawns here actually, keeping the king out of e6, the white king here is free to get to g5, it seems. And that could be useful. Let's see this now. King d7. These pawns are actually keeping the king out of d6 and e6 respectively. So king activity is another element of the position here. Another trump card emerging for white. And the king is actually aggressively positioned now on g5. Black dare not play a move like this, because king g6, this looks like a king which is getting too dangerous. Or is it? Hang on a sec. There's knight e5 check. Let me just check this. What would happen on f6? Before I say something extremely silly and non-checked. f6, not king g6, because knight e5 check. The king could go to h5 here, with the threat of bishop takes c6, pardon me, bishop takes c6, and then going to g6. So that would be the problem, the g6 square fundamentally, but not immediately. And that's the thing about chess. You've got to be careful about the tactics. Let's turn that off. So, king g5, f6, we've got king h5 as a move. We have king e7. The tricky knights, got to be careful of them forking the bishops at all times, of course. Bishop f4, controlling that e5 square. This knight seems a bit passive for the moment. a6, h4, and it looks as though an idea now for h5 and h6, which would kind of isolate the f pawn and give the white king access to these squares potentially, f6 and h6. Bishop g3 being played here. Knight f6. We have check, and now king f4. White is taking his time. Bishop g2. King goes to g5. It looks as though h5 and h6 is on the cards. And now, after knight f6, we have h6 here. Check, and it looks as though, is this just going to be a draw with the checks? White has to do something other than king h5 here. He does. Temporary pawn sack, king h4. We have g takes h6, because otherwise this looks pretty dangerous. This looks grim to play g5 and leave g6 and leave that pawn there, or g5 is en passant. So we have g takes h6, but now king h5, the king is getting some roads that it didn't have before. So by liquidating the double pawns, white has created another advantage in the position, a much more aggressive king than previously technically possible. Check, king g7, very, very aggressive king compared to black's king. That is one thing which the bishop pair and having the pawns here seems to have facilitated the liquidation, believe it or not, of black's apparent structural double pawn weakness, has led to even greater king activity. Knight d4 hitting f5, another fork to be aware of. Bishop e4, knight f2. We have bishop b1 here, holding f5. Knight g4, bishop f4. And black now commits to f6. They would seem a little bit dodgy to play f6. What's the actual threat here? Are the bishops containing the knights in this position? Do the knights really need the pawn on f6? Does this knight in particular need the pawn on f6? Let me just check here. What is white actually potentially? What is the actual intention potentially? Let's say black. Let's imagine this scenario, because this is quite a committal decision. F6. Let's say black plays a move like, I'm trying to say a non-committal move. We can't move his king. If he moves to e7, the problem is bishop e4 here, looking at b7. And this is getting dangerous, this position here, because now there's pressure here. And if here, f6 check, it starts to get nasty basically. Yeah, if f7 or b7 are going to drop, f7 there might be king c6, so stronger is actually to take on b7. This position is winning for white. So this kind of scenario is very, very dangerous. So the bishops, in particular the light square bishop, has got two victims on both sides of the board here in this variation. Okay, so maybe trying to get out that pawn out of the firing line of this light square bishop. So we have f6, and we're still left with this pawn, though, on a light square, which is attacked. Bishop e4. We have knight f2. Is the bishop wanting to take there immediately? What about the knight takes f5? Magnus pauses for a moment. On move 64, he actually drops the bishop back, and we get another invitation for a repeat and a draw. Is Magnus teasing Nakamura? Bishop e4, knight f2. Is it going to be a draw? No, apparently. Bishop takes b7, swapping b7 for f5 this time. Or is that really the case? Not immediately, actually. If black plays knight takes f5 check, this is just clearly better for white. This position, we've just won a pawn basically and is winning with c6. Now the idea is not so simple as immediately taking on f5. It's knight d3. And the idea to hit the bishop and c5, both of these pawns are vulnerable, the c5 and f5 pawn. And if the bishop in this position protects c5, then knight takes f5, king takes, knight takes is potentially safe on c takes d, but even here it's dangerous for black on bishop c6. This position is dangerous for black, an advantage for white technically. If that's really exploitable, though for a win is a different matter, it might actually be on the verge of a fortress draw of some sort. So we see this position where black has given himself the option. He doesn't want to go into the knight takes f5 line. So this knight d3 seems to be much cleverer than the immediate knight takes f5. Because the upcoming king takes f6 and c6 seems really dangerous. So this knight d3, black is temporarily here a pawn down with this knight d3 threat. Temporarily a pawn down. Okay, so as mentioned, if white plays bishop d6 to protect the pawn, then it can lead to an advantageous but potentially a fortressy type position. If the bishop drops anywhere else, then actually it's not this pawn that's taken. That's still an advantage for white. The knight's going to move somewhere, then c6. No, black actually would prefer here to take the c5 pawn, hitting the bishop. And the bishop moves, actually we can wipe out the other pawn's, job done. The knights wipe out the two pawns, job done. And this should be getting to be okay for black. It'll be very, very difficult for white to win that, if at all possible. So in fact, we're reaching a point where is this really going to be a win, either with a bishop going here, which seems to be one of the strongest, or anywhere else. Bishop c7, knight takes c5, again hits the bishop there. This position is only a technical advantage for white. Is it actually winning? So Magnus needs something actually really quite good here, unless he can really see those as winning outcomes eventually. And he plays an intriguing move in this position at move 67. This might be a time for you to pause the video. So remember, the bishop's attacked. What do you want to do? You've got these pawns which are both being victimized by the knights. The centralized knights are victimizing the two pawns here. What do you do in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, you might want to study it for a bit and come up with a move which might lead to better winning chances than what has been shown so far, better practical winning chances. So I'll give you 5 seconds starting from now to pause the video. Let's turn that off. Okay, Magnus actually played the astonishing king takes f6, just dropping a bishop it seems, but remember he's already a pawn up, so technically it's 2 pawns for a bishop now. This is a 2 pawns for a bishop scenario. Knight takes f4, the bishop is taken. I mean, what else? The thing is about this position, you might think, well, taking the pawn, it leaves that dangerous f pawn This is too dangerous, surely. If black took on c5, actually let's check here. If black didn't take the bishop, if he took on c5, bishop d5, and white can continue here with things like bishop d6 or king g5, this f pawn is actually quite good here. It's still a little bit of work to do for white, but white is essentially doing very well here with the extra pawn and the bishop here. So black snapped up the bishop here, knight takes f4. And we have actually quite a strange scenario. The king actually drops back here to fork both knights. Two knights being forked by the king. And they protect each other here with the f knight coming to e2. Is it a good idea to have two knights protecting each other? Apparently, Malcolm Payne, one of the live commentators, said it's not often a good idea for two knights to be held protecting each other. They seem actually not the most stable structure in the world here. But especially in this scenario, we've got two potentially rampant passed pawns. And still a remaining bishop, which is threatening to extinguish black's last pawn, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to mate with the two knights. So, in terms of risk for white losing, it seems to be minimal, especially if you can get black's remaining pawn in any scenario, just sacking the bishop. But here, with the two rampant passed pawns, f6, there's still some pressure now here on black. How can black actually handle this with the two stumbling knights here, which at the moment are clinging on to each other for dear life? Black first of all moves his pawn out of the firing line immediately with a5. This is fixed now with a4. So we have an interesting scenario. What can the knights do here? And also the king against these two pawns. We see king f7 blocking this one. It seems logical. Check. Kicking the king away. And now, a remarkable idea. Note that the king is also being cut off f7. A remarkable idea in this position. And it's all in the follow-up, really. The magic is in the follow-up. What does white actually play here? This is a remarkable endgame move. Can you see what white plays here? White actually retreated his king to e4. You might think, hold on a sec, let's have a look at this position. Let's have a look if c6. This might actually be quite good for white as well. Or is it? It's going to be tricky, this position. It's given as an advantage technically, but it might be a fortressy type position, which is a real risk of these types of positions in general. No, so it's not actually c6. Instead, we see the retreat king e4. And now it seems, okay, c6 is, the pass pawn's on the cards clearly, but there's another factor here about these knights. If king e3 is played, the knight is actually double attacking both knights, meaning that if either knight moves, once the king's on e3, one of the knights is going to drop. And worse than that, the bishop is then going to be threatening something like bishop c4, hitting the knight on e2, causing one of them to move. So actually the knights are endangered species in this position after king e4. White is really threatening, remarkably, king e3. This is the big threat here, king e3. Just to illustrate that, it's not about the pawns at all here for a moment. King e3 or bishop c4, in fact, both knights are holding each other for dear life, and it just takes a little nudge, this position, and what happens there? Simultaneous undermining of both knights. If one knight moves, the other drops. Yes, it's quite amusing. But okay, so knights in advance of king e3, knight c2 is played. So this is becoming like an endgame study. It doesn't seem to be about the passed pawns at all. This is just what you might think. No, the knights are forced onto retreat here. And it's only now that the knight's on the second rank away from the c-pawn. The c-pawn makes a run for it with c6. We have check, king e5. So c7's on the cards. We have knight takes a4 here. And now if c7, then there's knight b6 just in time. So that's the idea. Knight takes a4. It's not just to get that pawn. But bishop b3, forking the pawn knights again. Knights are meant to do the forking. They're not supposed to be forked all the time. But in this game, they're being forked all the time, it seems. And here, one of them's going now. One of them's leaving the scene after knight b6. What else? One of them's going to be dropping off. And this is good for white. So yeah, knight b6 is played. Bishop takes c2. And we're still left with two really dangerous passed pawns. a4. Now in this position, can we get the knight away from the queening square? Well, not here, because the knight can go back. So actually white plays c7 first, and black is pretty helpless here. If he moves the pawn, bishop b3. Now, this didn't happen actually, he didn't move the pawn. The game ended with king f7 and bishop takes a4. The knight can't take because of the queening. There's no magical check or anything, which helps black here. If the check here, check. This is a winning position as an example, where if black takes that, bishop d7, king d6, and actually we're approaching a zugzwang here, believe it or not. This position here is an important zugzwang to bear in mind, where the knight can't actually sack itself for the remaining pawn. But yeah, in the game, after a4, c7, a3 wasn't actually tried. This is tricky, a little bit tricky. a3 wasn't tried. So yeah, just to recap here, a3, bishop b3. This is really tricky. Black can be in a zugzwang here, but we see actually king f7 and bishop takes a4 with black resigning here actually at move 78. So let's have a look at this scenario. It's ruled out the obvious. Taking with just queen. There's no magic check here or anything. So check here. And the knight wants to try and get back to a square where it can stop the pawn here. Now b6 or d6. Let's try d6. King d5. Knight going to c8. We reach again a position where the knight is not holding the fort here. After king e5, white even gets to keep this pawn, and this is just winning. Black is overloaded. So that was on d6 there, and if the knight goes to b6 here, king c5. Now here it doesn't help. Knight takes a4 doesn't help. The king goes here, and this is just queening. And if knight c8, this again is the knight is not good as a blockade here. Knight a7, king b6. It's getting out of the way. It's over. The king can't help the situation. Yep. Incredible. So yeah, bishop takes a4 is winning. Knight c8 immediately. We can keep both pawns, check, bishop e6, and actually we can even queen this one in this scenario for the f pawn to do the job. The f pawn is going to be winning. King's going to be got out of the way, and it's not a stalemate or anything. Apart from, yeah, no, f6 is winning as well here. So yeah, f7. So bishop takes a4 was the end of this game. So some remarkable endgame concept here, where it seems Magnus avoided very, very tricky technical endgames where it was unclear actually, although he technically had an advantage if it was actually winning. He went to a much clearer scenario where, remarkably, the passed pawns were kept on hold. The king actually retreated to try and fork the knights to actually win one of the knights. And it was only then the c-pawn was activated a bit further, and it seems the knights are just unable to hold themselves up. One of them fell, and the passed pawns crashing through basically in all scenarios then thereafter. So, remarkable endgame masterpiece from Magnus Carlsen against Hikaru Nakamura, who not so long ago was ranked 2 on the live rating list in the world. So it makes his record against Nakamura staggering now, 12-0. Of course, this could all be a tease for Nakamura when he challenges to become world chess champion, rather like Alexander Alekhine did to Capablanca. Everyone believing that Alekhine could not win a single game against Capablanca, but proved everyone wrong. So maybe it's just a tease on the build-up to the ultimate challenge for the World Chess Championship. But at the moment, it's a crushing 12-0 now, in classical games at least, to Magnus Carlsen. With quite a few draws though, 18 draws. Yeah, a fantastic game from an endgame perspective to see what happened. It became like an endgame study. So very, very interesting stuff there. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.